Welcome, brave souls, to the chilling depths of horror and detail. Today we're going to share scary Wendigo horror stories. First story, Wendigo experience. So my name is Nicholas and I'm 14, and I always believed in paranormal anomalies and such. I live in Canada, so Bigfoot and Wendigo are my favorite paranormal beings. But I'm not afraid of them because I'm a Christian and go to a Christian school. So last year I went to a Bible camp. They had canoeing, shooting bottles, making shelters, and church. It's fun, and I decided to take the outdoor fun week. So we got to the camp. It had a cafeteria, bunk bed cabins, and more was not fenced and was close together, which made me feel safe. So after my first night, we decided to play Fugitive. It's a game where you have two cops and one main fugitive. When you come in 2 feet of a person, they must give you a hint to where the main fugitive is. They only have 3 arrests, which are hints. So I got picked for main fugitive and started running into the woods to find a hiding place. We all had radios to make sure we were safe. I found a pine tree, which I climbed up and hid, and they had 5 minutes to find me. 2 minutes and I hear my cabin master say, "Game over, come back for him," in the woods, not on the radio, which is odd, but I listened and went into the deeper part of the woods. And when I heard him say, "Nicholas, come in the game is over," I ran towards the voice, and then the radio beeped. Fugitive was not found. Come back to the cafeteria for lunch. I froze in my place thinking, what is happening at this point? I was crying, and then I heard sticks breaking and teeth chattering like echolocation or something of that sort. And I remembered Wendigo's toy with people or their prey, and I made the decision to run as fast as I could to the cafeteria. I started running fast as I could. I was feeling weak, but my heart was in my throat. And I heard leaves behind me rustle, and I finally get to the cafeteria and tell my friends and cabin master what happened. And I got my parents to come and pick me up, and I went home, and to this day, I don't go to Bible camp in fear of what that Wendigo or thing would do to me. Also, I live in the Northwest Territories where the Wendigo is a common occurrence. Second story. I believe I had a close encounter with something strange in Mendocino National Forest. This has left me feeling extremely shook, and I'd love some opinions, especially from someone with experience. Last year, I had a very strange experience in a national forest out in California. I was by myself on a road trip with my dog, and I was driving pretty far into Mendocino National Forest. I like to camp in national park/forest because it's isolated so my dog can roam and they're free of charge. A trade-off for sketchy/rough drives into the park sometimes and lack of service/assistance. Anyway, I was driving up this dirt road, kind of curling up a mountain around maybe 5 p.m. It was very nice out, sunny and warm with a slight breeze. Nothing serious happened, but I felt extremely uncomfortable driving into the area, and that feeling did not let up. Driving up the mountain, I felt like I shouldn't stay there, and I even texted my boyfriend about it for as long as I could before my phone completely lost service. I was looking for a sign of another person having been around the area lately, but didn't see anything. I pulled over and got out of my car with my dog to look over the edge and noticed a dead squirrel and some broken glass mixed in with the dirt and gravel road. Yuka, my dog, starts to growl slightly. She is vocal, but I've almost only ever seen or heard her growl at or with other dogs. I did see her growl at a possum once, so it could be something she smelled maybe. This place continued to make me feel quite on edge, but I pride myself in being an independent traveler and backpacker, so I decided to continue at least a bit further with my grumbling pup to see if I could find a good place to camp. I continued to notice more dead animals. Keep in mind, no one is going to be going more than 5 to 10 miles per hour up this thing. And that's if there's anyone even there. I hear men's voices. They sound close, and I think I should call out to them, so I stop my car, but then kind of freeze up and feel like I shouldn't. I can't really make out what they're saying. I don't see any sign of people anywhere, and I get back in my car and continue to slowly drive forward and cautiously look for where the voices could be coming from. I've never ran into other people in a national park or forest when I've gone this deep in. The unsettling feeling grows about the voices, which have sort of come and gone a few times, and I give up and begin to turn my car around. I honestly don't remember how Yuka was acting on the way down. I was scared and focused on getting out of there. I just distinctly remember being surprised at her grumbling when we were standing outside of my car. Kind of dangerously quickly, I went back down the mountain, not seeing any sign of anyone. I decided to spring for luxury and get a hotel for the night. I figured I was just fine. Huge and open spaces can be intimidating, I told myself. And the voices could have been echoing from somewhere far off, and they just sounded close. Animals die. Glass gets broken. Nothing happened. Cool. But I remember this place. It sticks with me. Whenever I'm watching scary movies, if I'm walking my dog in the woods at night, nothing compares to the feeling I had driving up that mountain, and it's honestly kind of interesting to me as well as frightening. I recently happened across some information as well as some Native American lore that made me feel extremely uneasy. Fast forward a year, I've mentioned this place to a few people and the haunting vibes it gave me, but nothing much more. Googled the national park once and didn't see anything, but didn't look much either. I like scary movies and things of that nature, hence my fascination in this little event, LOL. So my boyfriend and I were coming up on finishing our road trip just yesterday. We were in Wyoming for a wedding. There were only 2 to 3 hours left, and the sun had set, so we decided to listen to some scary podcasts and YouTube videos. We went from the No Sleep podcast to the X-Files and ended up on a True Stories video dealing with Native American lore. I'm half paying attention, petting my dog, playing Pokemon on an emulator. And I hear the narrator mention Wendigos. Very briefly says what they are and casually mentions they can mimic voices. I mean it when I say the most horrible chills I have ever had in my life crawl down my spine, and I stare at my boyfriend and ask him if he remembers that national forest I was freaked out about last year. He says he does, and he reminds me that he texted me I was probably close to a Wendigo. He did. I remember him saying that, but didn't know much about their lore and thought he was just being funny like, yeah, Bigfoot is probably stalking you, or some other dad joke. And he was like, no, I was mostly joking, but I said it specifically because you said you were hearing voices that you couldn't find a trace of. I feel strange AF, and I start Googling Wendigos, etc., etc. They are allegedly able to mimic human voices, and they would live in that sort of area. It all matched up. Obviously, there's a ton of questionable info out there, but I tried to find more reputable websites and authentic experiences. I then specifically looked up missing persons in the area, and the first headline that catches my eye is another family goes missing in Mendocino, and I went through different websites and news articles of people going missing, but they're all a little hidden underneath national park websites and pictures of trees. I remembered looking up the forest about a year ago and didn't see anything and realized these stories didn't seem to be talked about much, which also piqued my intuition. It was stated that well over 100 people in the past 8 years have gone missing and not been found, on top of many which are found dead. It just has my intuition super spiked. Remembering how unsafe I felt and how much I wanted to get out of there terrifies me, and I felt so uneasy about what I was hearing and do to this day. My dog and I are very close. She was a stray that started following me one day, and I ended up bringing home from Costa Rica. So her little growls along the way makes me feel like there was something wrong. Even though it was just a storytelling video, those stories originate from somewhere. I've done a lot of solo traveling both in and out of the country, and I have never had such a bad feeling, on top of seeing an unnecessary amount of dead animals in a national forest, which just seems strange. I don't think I'll be doing more solo traveling unless it's around civilization, LOL. Does anyone know about authentic Native American lore, or has anyone else had a kind of inexplicable experience like this? Extra points if you've had bad vibes in Mendocino National Forest from a Wendigo. Third story. Wendigo in New Hampshire. Husband and I had a weird experience. We live in NH on 5 acres of property. Moved here last year. My son and I always walk on the property, half cleared, half wooded trails. The past month our walks have felt different, just a weird sense I have felt. Cat has also been heightened in behavior, not that it is relevant. Since that feeling, I've started keeping closer to the house. Last week I went out in the afternoon, was hearing animal noises odd for the time of day. I thought I saw a deer in the woods, but in the past month all animal sightings, which used to be daily, deer, turkeys, fox, had subsided. So I thought, oh, maybe deer are back. Told husband about it. And we just figured we'd keep an eye. Forward to yesterday, husband and I put our son down for the night. And while in the room, We hear what sounds like coyotes, but high-pitched, more amplified sound than we had heard before. Not a usual noise. Didn't think much, until husband went to lock up for the night. He does a quick yell my name. We both look out the slider door and see a large figure out at the tree line. Husband grabs gun and flashlight. As soon as that clicked on, it was gone. The only image we saw was probably 7 foot tall and lanky figure, upright and all dark as the moon was under clouds. We basically had our stomachs drop. Am now not going outside with our son, far at least, and Eve saged our house. Could it be Wendigo? Mother-in-law jumped to that. Apparently she heard folklore growing up. Fourth story. Have you ever heard of a skinwalker? I've avoided telling this story before because I want to believe that it wasn't real, that it was just a dream, but I've read so many similar encounters that I feel like maybe I should tell someone. Maybe it was real and something like this really lives out there. I wish I'd known it was possible back then. The story starts at my aunt's house. At the time, my mother and father were going through a divorce. I was about 11 and my younger sister was only 6. The details of the divorce don't really matter, but we were staying at my aunt's house with my mom until she could find a place she could afford on her own. My sister and I were too young to fully understand, so it was almost like a vacation. It helped that my aunt had a really cool house. It was a big and seemed even bigger to a couple of kids. I don't really know house lingo, but it was very modern with 2 long main wings. One side housed the bedrooms and a small library. The other had the kitchen. The kitchen had these huge windows, the kind lots of more modern-styled houses have where they take up the whole wall. Nestled in this wall of windows was a sliding glass door, but my sister and I rarely used it because it was large and heavy and hard for us to open. Another thing about these windows, though, was that they faced the woods. My aunt's house was surrounded, right on the edge of a large wooded area. The trees ended only a couple feet away from where the sliding glass door was. Of course, this was one of the benefits of her house. Living near the woods was peaceful, or at least that's what my aunt always said. My aunt had a small sitting area by the windows where she could watch nature. She told us that oftentimes she'd had little herds of deer walk through, and that she'd even seen a mountain lion once. Anyway, you get the idea. It was a big house with big windows, and it sat close to the woods. For the majority of the time that we lived there, we had no issue. My sister and I would even go play in the woods, always staying inside of the house. My mother would often sit in the sitting area by the windows and keep an eye on us. We'd play hide and seek or tag or see if we could climb the trees. Things changed at night, though. I hated those windows at night. When I'd walk down the long hallway to the south wing of the house to get a glass of water from the kitchen or something, I'd always see the trees moving, swaying unnaturally. Not like from wind, where it started from the top and worked its way down, but like something was pushing against them from below, and the tree shook from that. It freaked me out, but I was 11, so it wasn't that hard. I'd usually just hurry up and get my water and run back to my room. I hated it so much that I rarely forgot to get water before bed after the first couple times. Wasn't risking that creepy shit again. Later on, I wasn't given a choice, though. One night, I had a dream that my mother was calling me. Her voice was coming from the kitchen, asking for my help with something. I stood up from bed and made my way towards where she called, my brain fuzzy from sleep. Her voice was soft, but it carried to me as I walked, warm and familiar. The closer I got, though, the weirder it sounded, becoming slightly distorted and deeper. It was like a mix of my mother's voice with some animalistic cries that just got louder until I was shocked awake, just before I stepped through the doorway into the kitchen. I quickly looked around, confused. My mom wasn't there, and the whole house was dark except for the moonlight that illuminated just enough of the room for me to know it was empty. I shrugged it off as a sleepwalking dream, though I'd never had one before, so I turned around and walked back to my room. A few nights passed before it happened again. This time, it was my father who called me. "Please," he called, "I need to talk to you. Come here." Just like last time, I stood up from my bed like in a trance, aware and unaware of what I was doing. Each step brought me closer to the kitchen where I could hear my father, his voice becoming more gravelly and broken as I walked. I stepped into the kitchen and thought I saw him there, standing by the kitchen island, illuminated in the moonlight. He turned and looked at me, and I woke up, realizing there was nothing there after all. It took a few days again, but on the third night I heard my little sister. She was crying for me, telling me she hurt herself and she needed my help. I stood up and started hurrying to the kitchen, ever the big sister. This time I barely noticed when her voice started changing, becoming a distorted gasp as I drew closer. I stepped into the kitchen and saw her. She was knelt crying on the ground near the windows. I started to walk over to her, but stopped when I realized something. She was kneeling behind a glass. She was outside. Her cries became a laugh, and I startled awake. But I still saw a shape kneel just outside the window. Only it was bigger and dark and misshaped. I screamed in terror, and it moved, faster than anything I'd seen before, disappearing into the woods. My mother came running from her room, turning on the lights and comforting me. I told her about the sleepwalking in passing, so she chalked it up to me, still having been asleep when I told her about the monster. She walked me back to my room and had me take some sleeping medicine to help me get back to sleep. After that, everything seemed like it might be okay. A week passed, and then two. My mom found a nice apartment that she planned to move us into. My sister and I were sad to leave, but I was secretly relieved. I'd been on edge every night since it happened, wondering if it would call to me again. But everything was silent until the night before we were meant to leave. I was just starting to drift off to sleep when I heard shuffling outside my door. I froze, certain that the monster had returned for me, that it had somehow gotten in the house and was about to open my door, but the sound simply moved past me and down the hallway toward the kitchen. I stayed where I was, waiting to make sure it wasn't a trick, then got up as quietly as I could and crept over to the door. I hovered, unsure if I should open it. After a few seconds, I made up my mind to run to my mom's room and wake her up. I slowly cracked open the door and peeked into the hallway towards where the sounds were coming from. There, at the end of the hallway and shuffling into the kitchen, was the form of my little sister. I blinked and then squeezed my eyes shut and opened them again, making sure I wasn't asleep. But no, she was real, and she was disappearing into the kitchen right before my eyes. As I realized this, I realized I could hear something, a kind of faraway moaning whine coming from the direction she was going. Dread ran up my body, and I looked down the hallway at my mom's door, the opposite direction that my sister was walking. Fear told me to run and get her first, but instinct moved my feet towards the kitchen where my sister had gone out of my sight. I ran as silently as I could down the hall and peered around the doorway to look for her. There she was standing right in front of the windows, her eyes open but glazed. As I watched, I realized the trees were swaying, the same way they used to, but much faster now, and the swaying seemed to be getting closer, moving towards us at an alarming speed. I could hear branches breaking and the trees creak in protest as something hit them, and the moaning whine I had heard from far away was getting louder, sounding like a dying animal. One tree was rocked so violently a flock of birds flew screaming out of it into the night air. As this was happening, my sister was reaching for something, the lock on the sliding door. Even at 11, I knew something was coming through the woods towards us, and it was running, sprinting, right at my sister. I ignored my brain screaming at me to run the other way and race towards my sister. The noise was all-encompassing now. It had become a screeching so loud it sounded like it was all around me. I grabbed my sister around the waist, pulling her back just before her fingers touched the lock, and I pulled both of us behind the wall beside the windows, just out of sight. The sound stopped, the trees no longer swayed, and the screeching had fallen silent. I could hear my sister breathing frantically, but I held her mouth closed, willing her not to cry. My own breathing was shallow and fast, but as I tried to quiet it, I realized there was another sound. My sister's breathing, my breathing, and the even breathing of something else, standing just outside the window next to us. A too large humanoid shadow blocked the moonlight that usually fell into the kitchen, and I watched the figure reach out its unnaturally long arm. I held my breath as I heard a scratch against the sliding door and saw the shadow of the creature's arm touch where the handle of the door was. After a second, the creature withdrew its arm and let it fall to its side. Then it stood there still for what felt like hours. Finally, the shadow shrunk, and I could hear whatever it was leave. The underbrush rustled and the trees swayed, but the sound moved away this time instead of towards us. Still, I didn't move. I waited until all traces of its presence was gone before I slowly pulled my sister away toward the hall, keeping out of sight of the windows as much as I could. My sister was crying as I led her down the hall, and I think I was squeezing her hand too tight, but I felt overwhelming relief as I opened the door to my mother's room and crawled into her bed. My mother never believed us, of course, and we moved away the next day. I refused to return to my aunt's house ever since, and she eventually moved away. I've never had an encounter like that again, but that might be because I stay away from the woods like a plague now. If you're a fan of hiking or camping or living near nature, all I can say to you is good luck. Fifth story. Creepy rural Irish stories are rural and fracking creepy. Well, here's the dealio. I'm not a natural author, so forgive me for the awkward wording. I'm also only going by word of mouth, so if the narrative is a bit disjointed, that's influenced by how it was told to me. Now, most creepy stories and urban myths have this degree of it's true, it happened to me, or it happened to a friend of a friend. A lot of them have this as it happens narrative. They're awesome. They're works of art and seriously creepy. Me, I'm not trying to ply my trade as an author. The first story isn't something that happened to me, but a story that has been passed down my family since my great-great to the nth degree grandparents. My grandfather seems to find this a genuinely painful tale, but I'll never know what is going on with it unless someone else has some myth insight. The second one is something he experienced as a young man, and I don't know how much is elaborated. I do know it does seem to be based around a very true multiple murder. When he told me these, he was a very sane, very erudite, and very sober man, and he only told them on dark winter nights when he was in a pensive mood. As a bit of a background, my grandfather comes from a very small, very traditional West Coast Irish hamlet, the kind of place where there's more cows than people. This is a genuine fact about my grandfather's hometown. Irish Gaelic was thriving along even pre-revival, especially when he was a young man, and old myths mixed with very strong Catholicism. As a child, he used to tell me stories about shit like the Dullahan, which is a very popular story in his area. Ghost stories, stories about them little folks, the story about the washerwomen, stories about souls drowned at sea, and wicked creatures waiting to trip good Christian children up. As someone who's really interested in where our creepy stories and myths and legends ultimately come from, I grew up with a gold mine of strict Christian guilt and native mythology. Because I'm interested in where these stories come from, I was wondering if anyone else has come across anything like the stories my grandfather told. Does it stem from some urban legend or native mythology I haven't stumbled across? I don't think they're supernatural, but they might well be odd stories particular to my family or my grandfather's area, which does well happen, but I'm still wondering if they're an offshoot of one ghost story or another, you know? It's mere bloody-mindedness, and the fact that I really do find the study of this stuff interesting. So yeah, it's not the best place to post this, but it's also a place where I have a good chance of coming across someone who's come across the story before, right? Here we go. Story 1. My paternal grandfather's family, via my great-grandmother, have a long history of being up to no good. My grandfather always took a perverse pride in it. Thing is, I was always told that banshees are tied to important people in noble families. My family, about as far from noble as you could get, once upon a time. My grandfather always said, and still says, when he's in the mood, some families have banshees, but we were never good enough. We have this. Although myths is myths, it was always a thing that we didn't have a banshee. We had something else. I guess maybe this is a banshee for poor families? Anyway, the story. Along my grandfather's mother's family line, which ultimately is passed down to me, there has always been a weird occurrence when a family member dies, and it has happened for generations. It quite often happens when the eldest son or father dies, but it happens without fail when a daughter of the family line dies. Sometimes it happens for non-blood related women. There is some evidence that this myth is based along matrilinealness, but it's very women-based all the same. It never happens for a sudden death, but it always happens during a long illness. My grandfather's mother died after struggling through a long illness. He recalls how she got better, then succumbed to an infection and fever. It was touch and go. One night, just as it was getting dark, as his mother lay sweating palely in her bed, there was a heavy knocking at the front door. My great-uncle went to answer it and came back shrugging. They assumed it was local kids playing a joke. They didn't believe the myth any more than I do. Their mother had told them a similar thing had happened when her mother had died. But seriously? None of them believed it. A few hours passed. My great-grandmother turned and flailed in her fever. And then more knocking at the windows, more frantic than before. Again, there seemed to be noon there. Another hour or so, thudding at the door. Let me in, kind of pounding. They thought it was kids playing around, but felt sick with dread. The knocking kind of dulled in intensity after a night of torment, but it continued softly, insidiously. It stopped suddenly in the small hours of the morning. Not long after, my great-grandfather started shouting at my grandfather to get a doctor, or anyone. My grandfather sent his brother, who never spoke of this evening ever again. Even when the doctor arrived, my great-grandmother was beyond help and died soon after. None of them ever felt they were in danger, or like someone was trying to break into the house. Just that something was patiently, persistently calling to someone who it knew was one death's door. The fact that his mother told him a similar story about his grandmother's death, apparently, has always stayed with my grandfather. And I will say this, when my grandfather's wife, my grandmother, the living matriarch of the family at the time, and someone we all loved more than anything, suffered and succumbed to a botched operation, on the afternoon of her death, Ivan, my eldest cousin, turned up at the hospital. She hadn't really been keyed in, and I didn't think she knew how bad my grandmother was, but she was white as a sheet and merely said that she knew she had to be there. I never asked her why or how she knew, 'cause I know it would ruin the spooky. Anyway, any similar stories my grandpa might have ripped off for Tay spooks? Tongue sticking out? Story 2. This one is a bit more creepy, for reasons that will become apparent. It makes me think of the Wicker Man. My grandfather used to tell me about fairy circles, but also about fairy trees. Fairy circles are pretty self-explanatory, and if not, a quick Google will find you all kinds of new age hippie shit. I'm never quite sure if my granddad means that the tree in the story was seen as sacred to fairies, or if it was the land. I'm going to say it was a fairy tree, 'cause that's how I always understood it. Also, please realize we're talking about scary Irish fairies, not the camp tiny people with wings. 'Cause otherwise this would be hilarious. Anyway, in my grandpa's village/hamlet/tiny town, there was this old tree that was as old as anyone could remember. It was said to be sacred to the fairies, by which I mean the fecking scary psychopathic Irish fairies, not Tinkerbell, and nobody had ever been brave enough to risk screwing around with it. Even though they were all so very Christian, nobody messed with the fairy tree. I'm not even kidding. For this reason, this tree was old as balls. A family inherited the land for farming, but they always left the land near the tree alone and only farmed and grazed the rest of it. They were duly superstitious. My grandfather went to school with, but wasn't friends with, one of the kids of the family. Time passed. When my grandfather was a young man, one of the sons of this family inherited the land. He was a young, ambitious man with several children and a wife. He didn't believe in all this superstition. He often talked about chopping the tree down, but was always talked out of it by someone else. Several years down the line, he got a chance to upsize and claim several nearby fields and properties, and decided to become a big farmer and level the current field he had going already, so he chopped the tree down. Very soon afterwards, he went out working on the field and was never seen again. His house was burnt down to the ground on that same day. That much is true. I think the ruin stands to this day, or it did when I was small. That much is certain. I've seen the building, so I know something burnt down, and it creeped me the hell out as a kid. According to what my grandfather heard from reports and hearsay, the wife and children had been horribly mutilated and killed. The baby daughter had been thrown on a log fire and burnt to death. The wife had been injured and decapitated. Nobody knows what happened to Mr. Farmer. No matter what happened, whether the farmer killed his family or was killed by angry, superstitious villagers, it was a bloodbath. To my knowledge, or my grandfather's current knowledge, no corpse has ever been identified for the farmer. Make of that what you will. I personally always thought he killed his family, but family murder by superstitious villagers, a law of the Wicker Man, or something paranormal, it's a creepy story. It's also something my grandfather really does not talk about very often, which makes me think of village cover-up. At university, I met someone with family in the nearest big town, which is how we got talking before about that murder urban myth bit, who said that she had heard of a slightly scandalous multiple murder happening a long time ago in my grandfather's village, and that it had always seemed kind of Wickermanish. Since this is pre-internet, fairly isolated rural Ireland we're talking about, I haven't found any really potent info to verify what happened, and either way it's very fecking difficult to get documents on anything, especially if you live abroad. Seriously, what is it with Irish bureaucracy? But the fact that my friend knew something about this incident before I even tried to prompt her does send chills up my spine and make me wonder if there really is a story here. I was also told this story by a guy in a coffee shop in the county town. I was doing some small town sightseeing before heading to see family, and I got to tell him that my grandfather knew the phantom missing man, or at least his family. He double took, and so did I, so I think this myth is doing well enough. What the truth behind it is, I'm still wondering though. So yeah, any thoughts on this one either? TLDR, my family might have a shitty pound store banshee ripoff, and my grandfather might come from the town the Wicker Man was set in. He might know people who murdered a man and his family for cutting a tree down some 60-something years ago. I kid, but anyone know anything about where these creepy stories come from? Sixth story, the fog knife. Like all rural suburbs, we had urban legends growing up. The most memorable one to me is the legend of the fog knife. The fog knife appears every time there is a heated argument. It drives the wielder to kill their victim, and then themselves. There have never been any witnesses, and each time the knife is never found. You have to be careful when you get in a fight with your parents or your friends. If you get too mad, you might just look down to see the fog knife in your hand. It supposedly started a long time ago, like so long ago that the radio had just been invented and families sat in their living rooms eating dinner off of trays and listening to it together. Anyway, the legend starts with your typical American atomic family. A husband, a wife, a girl, and a boy. The story goes that one day, the dad came home and found his wife cheating on him with another man. He didn't catch them in the act, but he caught the man coming out of the house when he came home early from work. It was a very foggy afternoon, so much so that he couldn't see 10 feet in front of his car the whole way home. As the husband reached for the door to his house, the man coming out opened it, and the two locked eyes. The husband didn't know the man or what to think at that point. Before he could even fully understand the situation, he looked down to see that he was holding a knife in the man's chest. It was a crude knife with a rusty spike of a blade and a handle of carved wood. Later, 3 people were found dead, butchered in the most unimaginably horrifying way possible. The police determined that the husband had stabbed the man his wife was having an affair with, then in a fit of rage, butchered his wife before turning the knife on himself. The man was clearly insane, as the faces of all 3 bodies were slashes so severely they had to be identified through other means. The body of the perpetrator himself was found in the bathroom, stooped in front of a bloody sink mirror, with virtually all of his facial flesh cut off. It was a mystery to the investigators how the man could butcher himself so thoroughly without going unconscious. Thankfully, the children were not home. However, the murder weapon was never found. It was hypothesized that a sharp piece of glass was used to do the cutting, but that would mean he would have needed to break the mirror before killing the 2 victims. Thus was born the legend of the fog knife. Well, that's how they say it started anyway. There have been half a dozen murders in the surrounding area over the last 30 years. One of them had to do with a dispute over a property line, another with a divorce, another with a troubled teen arguing with their parents, a depressed housewife, a cokehead, the list goes on. All the murders had plausible explanations, but the one thing they had in common is that the murder weapon had either gone missing or couldn't be identified. As far as urban legends go, this one is a doozy. It fits the evidence like a glove. Still, it's preposterous to believe in the existence of vengeful magic knives. But what if the fog knife wasn't a knife? What would you do if you caught your mom cheating on your dad? What if you were already depressed or a little bit nuts, and that was the last thing you needed to drive you over the edge? I don't know what I'd do. But you know what I do know? A murder weapon doesn't walk away from a crime scene by itself. I told the story to my wife, so we could be careful. She goes out drinking with friends on Friday nights, and sometimes doesn't come back until the next morning. We've been arguing more and more lately, and I know the legend, so I make sure to lock the doors in case the fog knife is watching. She gets mad at me because she thinks I'm trying to stop her from leaving the house. Doesn't she know I'm doing it for her? The doors need to stay locked to keep the fog knife out. To keep him out? Why won't she stop screaming? Seventh story. I think I had an encounter with a skinwalker or a wendigo. This happened to me when I was 17 and in high school and living with my parents. My house at the time was in a very small town. The backyard faced open, empty fields and mountains for miles before you reached another civilization at all. My best friend lived next door and shared this field as our backyard in a way. I have to explain that his house that was built on a different street that ended in the field with a small cul-de-sac. I think there was supposed to be more houses built down this street to expand the town, but they clearly never got around to it. So his driveway was basically in this cul-de-sac even though no other houses were built there. This matters later in the story. I used to stay the night at my friend's house a lot in high school because I didn't have the best relationship with my parents. Every once in a while we would wake up to hear dragging and a weird gargling sound from the back porch. His room was a basement room with a window well to the back porch. It would happen maybe a couple times a month, but whenever we would gather the courage to check, nothing would be back there. This happened for years. One night haunts my friend and I to this day. My friend was getting ready to move, and we would stay up all night playing games and watching movies. We decided to go on a music drive to just vibe. So we hopped in his truck with high beams and swung out of the driveway, turning them on towards the field to use the roundabout. The light illuminated this thing. It looked like a person, but it wasn't. It was naked on all fours, abnormally large, particularly its limbs that seemed to fold under itself in an unnatural way. Its pale skin clung to it like it had to be stretched onto it. But the part that still sends shivers down my spine is its face. Its jaw hung open to this gaping black maw, like a snake unhinging its jaw to eat. Its black eyes glistened in the light as it looked at us. But just as it turned to see us, it quickly scurried backwards, almost like it was on rewind into the brush of the field. My friend and I were pale as ghosts. We both looked at each other like, "Did you see that too?" We were shaken. Let's just say we tried to have a good rest of the night, but we couldn't believe what we saw. We ended up just sitting there in his basement with guns ready and waiting to hear the gargling and dragging again, but we never did. Sorry that it's not very climactic, but it's the truth. I now don't live in that town anymore. There are times when I visit there, though. That empty field still feels like it's watching and waiting. Even though I can't see it, I can still feel like it's out there. Eighth story. Wendigo outside the camper. I realize how unbelievable this story might be, but I assure you it's entirely true. I've had countless experiences with the supernatural since I was 4. I'm 33 now, but this is one of the most terrifying ones I've had. I've looked at some of the stories in this community to see if there's anything I haven't discovered yet. I thought that if I share my encounter here, there might be someone who has some information that could help. Please don't comment if you don't believe in the supernatural. I've seen skeptics plastering their 2 cents on some posts. I'm looking for legitimate information. My questions are at the end of this. Thanks in advance. I had an experience with a wendigo this fall in early October in northern Minnesota in a state forest. very close to, if not on, a reservation. I've always heard that speaking of them can draw them to you, but I hadn't thought of or listened to any Wendigo stories any time close to my encounter. I was staying with some very dear friends. I'll call them M and C, and they have a camper in their yard by the lake for guests to sleep in. I had walked down to the camper from the house with my miniature dachshund, Ebony, around midnight and found that I needed to set some things up, primarily the heater. By the time I was done getting everything in order, it was approximately 1:30. I never thought to lock the door because, really, I figured it's in the middle of the woods, so there was nothing to worry about. I was wrong. I had closed the curtains, thank God, and I was having trouble falling asleep because my anxiety was going mad. M and C's dogs were barking outside, and their geese wouldn't stop honking. Ebony, who usually sleeps under the covers, was sitting on my hip while I laid on my side, and I could feel her turning her head back and forth, like she was trying to track something outside. I tried tucking her under the blankets to calm her down, but she kept returning to her perch on my hip. I have no idea how long I laid there. I would say at least 40 minutes, when all of a sudden I heard M's voice outside the camper. "Anybody in there?" And what sounded like claws dragged down the side of the camper. I almost called back to her when I realized, number one, she and C were both fast asleep by now, and number two, M knew I was in there. She wouldn't ask if anybody was. Suddenly, I noticed everything had gone absolutely silent outside. The dogs and the birds had stopped carrying on. The gusts of wind had even stopped. It was the kind of silence you hear about in horror stories. How the woods go mute when something evil is in the area. Then another thought hit me. Ebony would be losing her sh*t and barking at the door if that had been anything human. She was frozen on my hip, dead quiet, shaking. I didn't dare to move, but I was really starting to have to pee. And I remembered that I hadn't locked the door. I have no idea how long I laid there debating whether I should get up and use the bathroom and lock the door, but it felt like an eternity. In reality, I guess it was maybe 10 to 15 minutes. I thought it may have been a skinwalker at first, but remembered they don't mimic the voices of your loved ones to lure you into the woods. Wendigo ag do. I knew these creatures, demons, whatever they are, can lure humans out of their abodes if they make eye contact with you, and everything in me was screaming to make sure I didn't look outside. I made doubly sure I didn't look through any cracks in the curtains as I walked softly to the front of the camper and very slowly turned the lock, praying and holding my breath. I made sure to keep my eyes away from the windows as I crawled back in bed and pulled Ebony close, and she finally stayed under the blankets. I snuck a peek at my phone for the time before I laid down, figuring it had to be close to 3 a.m., the witching hour. It was about 2:30. As soon as I laid down, the wind kicked back up, and M and C's basset hounds erupted into howls as they came running down to the camper and a little ways into the trees, and the geese started their noise again. I heard the bassets come back to the camper, barking a few more times before they laid down outside the door to protect me. I didn't get out of bed again that night. I told M and C what had happened the next morning. I think I was hoping M would say she had come down to check on me and Ebony, but she confirmed what I already knew. They had gone to bed as soon as I had left the house. I said a prayer over their house, the camper, and all of us the following night, and had an uneventful night. Thank God. I also spoke with another guy who's familiar with the supernatural to see if he knew any more about Wendigo ag. I'm not sure how accurate the information he gave me was, or if it's reliable at all, but when I asked him why Ebony hadn't made a peep, I had assumed it was because she was absolutely petrified. He said a Wendigo can control animals to keep them from alerting their owners about its presence. He also told me one. They can't enter houses that aren't made of wood directly from the forest they're hunting in, tents and campers included, because they consist of man-made materials too. A lock is useless. They can unlock and open a door so they can try to lure you outside. And 3. They typically stay in the woods, but they will come into a smaller town and never into a city. I had never heard of any of what he told me before, so again, I can't speak for accuracy, but I also haven't researched the claims either. He also advised me never to go outside to pee at night if I ever go camping, and to bring a bucket or something to use, and to make sure that I always close tent flaps and curtains before falling asleep. He said if the flaps are open so you can see outside, the Wendigo can make eye contact with you and draw you out. After leaving M and C's to go to my father's house for a few days, I had the distinct feeling of being watched when I took Ebony outside after dark. My father lives 3 hours away from M and C, but his house is in the country. I told myself it was only the fear from the experience and what I know about the Wendigo triggering an overactive imagination. I never heard anything, and I watched Ebony's behavior very closely, and she didn't act like she had in the camper. I'm moving back to that area from Canada, and this experience has been weighing heavily on my mind. I've been trying to find any information about warding them off, or if they have a home hunting range like cougars do, or if they move on from a region. My prayers did work the second night, so I figure I can pray over the property. I also have holy water that I can use, since the Wendigo is an evil spirit that possesses people or physically manifests. Frustratingly, a majority of what comes up in searches is utter garbage like Wikipedia. Does anyone know if a Wendigo stays in one area? Are my concerns about it coming back when I get moved into my cabin warranted? Or am I worrying excessively? Do you have any tips for warding them off? Ninth story. Wendigo showed itself to me in North Carolina. A little info to help prior to reading. I have always been very sensitive to the supernatural and have seen sense things many times before. I am a born-again Christian and often use my spiritual authority towards demonic presences. I went on a trip to North Carolina with my now ex-boyfriend and his family about 2 years ago around the same time. We stayed with his grandparents who live in a large farming community, a town with a population of maybe 40 people. This was also close to the Outer Banks. Fast forward to about day 4 into the trip. It is New Year's and around 11 p.m. I headed to bed early as I was in a tough spot with my boyfriend. We had been arguing frequently. As I was beginning to fall asleep, in that semi-lucid consciousness where your thoughts begin to become your dreams, I began having nightmarish visions with demon-like faces and contorted apparitions. I was also lying on my stomach with my eyes closed. I was beginning to recognize that something was not right and became more awake. I felt as though something was watching me and felt like I shouldn't move. With my eyes still closed, being fully awake, I suddenly knew what was happening. In my head, I was seeing what I now know was a Wendigo. It was black, tall, large but slim-figured, with an elk/deer skull with hairy arms and lower half. I don't know how I was seeing it as my eyes were closed, but I knew that it was showing itself to me in my thoughts/consciousness. I had no idea what it was at the time, but I knew it was evil and it did not want me there. I was not afraid of it as I have spiritual authority over it. I opened my eyes and rebuked it in Jesus' name, and then it was gone. I didn't have the feeling that something was watching me any longer. Fast forward to the last night of the trip. I was outside alone, and it was evening. The sun was almost all the way set. I was near the house and looking into the woods, and I began to have the same exact feeling as before, and I knew that the Wendigo was watching me again. I proceeded to go inside and continue on with my evening. On the way home, I Googled descriptions of the being I saw, and the classic half-man, half-deer creature popped up, checking all the boxes of the description. I guess I am positing this to see if anyone else has had a similar experience in that area, or at all. I fully believe that these supernatural beings exist and want nothing more than to do evil things. 10th story. I believe what I saw was a Wendigo. Hello, Dr. Sebastian, I would like to speak with you. That is what a cold voice said to me over the phone. The voice then explained that there was a family who needed food to be delivered to them, and I then asked why she asked me an astrophysicist. She then replied with, "We would really like you to deliver or at least purchase food for them." I could not say no, so I asked her for the location of the family. She gave it to me, and I decided to ask the family what they want when I arrived. I then drove to the location, parked my truck, and entered the small wooden house. When I entered, I got a chilling feeling in my spine. I then drew my firearm and walked slowly while calling for someone. It was pitch black within the house except the small amount of light entering the house through the curtains. I then walked into their kitchen, and that is when I froze in fear. There it was sitting with its legs crossed, looking at me. It was as tall as me sitting, and I'm around 6 feet 5 inches in height. It had long talons. It was skinny. Its skin was gray, and its eyes were almost as white as light, but far less bright. I could see its rib cage, and then it spoke. It said in a child's voice, "Hello, Dr. Sebastian. How are you?" I screamed like a Viking in the midst of war and shot it 8 times in the heart. Its scream sounded like an Aztec death whistle. I ran back to my truck and left. I knew that thing is what I spoke to, and I knew if I were to tell my friend, he would show up with his entire team, and they would have been turned into its dinner. That is all I can remember. But the way it looked at me screamed, "I have ascertained your soul, and there is nothing you can do about it." I visited the location 2 years later with my mates. The place was in a horrible state. The wall had scratch marks, there was urine everywhere, and the only thing we could smell was the urine and blood. As I stepped into my apartment, I got a weird feeling. My roommate then greeted me. She asked me what I had done, and I told her that I went with her brother and our friends to an old cabin. 2 hours later, while I'm trying to sleep, I hear a tapping noise. It was coming from my window, and I knew something was wrong. My apartment is on the 2nd floor. There are no trees for at least 10 to 20 meters, and most trees in the area are short. I did not even dare to move, and then my roommate came into my room. "CB, do you have toothpaste? Because I have run out," she said. She then looked at the window, and the tapping speed increased. "Don't move," I said. After 2 hours, the sound stopped, and we both slept in the living room. Thanks a lot for watching the video. Till the end, subscribe to Horror in Detail for more videos. Drop your suggestions in comment section.